Hi, everyone. I'm Claudia Yagubi, Roshan Distinguished Professor of Persian Studies and Director of the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies at UNC. My colleagues and I are here today to draw on our collective expertise to help make sense of the events of the past 2 weeks. I'm deeply grateful to my colleagues for generously agreeing on very short notice to share their knowledge and insight with us today. I'll be serving as the moderator for today's conversation, and this event will include brief presentations from our speakers, and then we'll have Q&A. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, and we'll try to address as many as possible. The webinar is being recorded and may be shared publicly after the event. We have the live captions activated. So if you click on the CC button on your Zoom toolbar, you can enable them. Today's event explores how geopolitics in the Middle East impacts not only the region, but also our lives as US citizens. My colleagues, experts in the field, will offer deep analysis of these dynamics. But just as importantly, as a cultural studies scholar myself, I'd like to take a few minutes to center the humanity of ordinary people caught in the crossfire. In that spirit, I'll be sharing some of my own lived experiences surviving Iraqi bombardment during the Iran-Iraq War in 1980s, and now witnessing another devastating war unfold from a distance in the diaspora. I speak as someone who lived under Islamic Republic, who left only 19 years ago, but who continues to grieve, endure, and resist from afar. Since October 2023, tens of thousands of civilians across the region, including Palestinians, Syrians, Lebanese, Yemenis, Israelis, and now hundreds in Iran, have lost their lives. I share my story not to isolate my pain, but to connect it to the broader suffering of those whose lives are too often reduced to numbers or political abstractions. To witness from afar is to carry the weight of both memory and longing, and to insist on the humanity of all those living and dying through war. Over the past 2 weeks, I've been carrying a heavy weight, a very emotional weight, as I watched Iran come under fire. The haunting images, the uncertainty, the collective fear, they've stirred something deep in me, reopening wounds I thought had long healed. As I watched the events unfold, I was transported back to the fear and instability of my own war-torn childhood. I kept thinking Iranian people deserve better. Iranians who have lived under authoritarianism for over 45 years deserve life. Beneath every headline are families like mine, evacuating cities, rushing to the basements, comforting children, standing in long lines for water, food, and gas, and trying to protect one another while the sky rains terror. I write this not to take a political stance, but to humanize those whose voices are so often drowned out by geopolitics, the civilians. The children who do not choose war, yet grow up carrying its trauma, the mothers who sing lullabies under the threat of bombs, the fathers who risk everything to keep their families safe. If we are to make sense of this moment or any of the wars and, conflicts that I mentioned, we must begin by seeing the people whose lives it quietly destroys long after the last missile lands. And don't tell me these were only targeted attacks because I have lost friends in this war. So here's how my childhood was spent. The Iran-Iraq War in 1980s was an enormous blow to my childhood and to everyone's life in the country. One of my second cousins became the first Armenian martyr in the war. And another one was held as a prisoner of war in Iraqi prisons until 1990. I was 6 years old when the war began and 14 when it ended. The trauma stayed with me in recurring nightmares and somatic trauma responses for decades after the ceasefire. At the start of the war, Khomeini regularly appeared on television with propaganda messages. Soon we became attuned to the language of sirens. The red siren, Agir Qermez, warned of incoming Iraqi aircraft. The white siren, Agir Sefid, signaled that the threat had passed. Every time the red siren sounded over Tehran, we rushed down to the first floor or basement to take shelter. I was terrified. My eyes would grow into what my parents called two big black saucers. The trauma returns every time I hear a siren, including when we had our campus shooting 2 years ago. Eventually, my parents decided to move us temporarily to Rudahen, a small town an hour east of Tehran beyond the believed range of Iraqi missiles. But the war dragged on for 8 years. We couldn't stay in Rudahen permanently. We rented apartments, stayed with relatives, or pitched tents in people's backyards. Winters were brutal. My cousin and I had to take turns placing our feet between each other's legs to stay warm at night, and I was only 8 at that point. We moved between Tehran and Rudahen, living in each place on and off for the war's duration. When we lived in Rudahen, my father often returned to Tehran for work or to retrieve essentials. Every trip was nerve-wracking. We never knew when or where the next missile would fall. Some memories are still vivid, like the times Iraqi missiles hit so close that our windows shattered. Once my father took us to see a site where a missile had struck and destroyed an entire neighborhood in northern Sabalan near Tehran. I didn't understand why he brought us here. It was horrifying. He said only that I would understand someday, that I needed to grow resilient. Now I know he was referencing a legacy of resilience passed down through generations of Armenians who had endured centuries of war, genocide, and displacement. That day still lives in my mind, but now I carry it with gratitude for his lesson in ancestral endurance. The Iran-Iraq War didn't just shape my childhood, it revealed the many ways war transforms identity, memory, and belonging. It taught me how trauma settles most heavily on those already pushed to the margins like children. And yet, even through the sirens and shattered glasses, we endured. And now, as I witnessed my homeland gripped once again by fear and uncertainty, I was reminded that behind every political maneuver are ordinary people, civilians who are trying to survive, to comfort their children, to preserve their dignity amidst destruction. But what was happening then, during my childhood, felt different. In the 1980s, we lived with sirens and missiles for an hour or two at most each day in Tehran. The battlefield was elsewhere, along the border cities. There were brief moments of reprieve. Back then, there was a rhythm to the violence. In contrast, this later war became constant, 24/7, embedded into every aspect of civilian life. No place felt safe. It wasn't just the border cities, it was everywhere. And no hour was spared. You had to have direct connection with Iranians on the ground, like my family members there, to know what I'm talking about, as mainstream news media was telling you a different story. Unlike the war I lived through, this one was fought not only with bombs, but with images, misinformation, and propaganda amplified by the news media and social media. We hadn't had access to global narratives in 1980s, nor did we carry the burden of sorting truth from distortion in real time. Now people were being wounded, not only by shrapnel, but by the emotional and psychological warfare of the digital age. What I lived through as a child had become someone else's present. Then on June 21st, the US struck Iran's nuclear sites. Iran retaliated, and though there was no reported American casualties, the shift was clear. This was no longer proxy warfare, but direct confrontation. The news hit me like a blow, the kind you don't just read, but absorb in your bones. I was crying and shaking, unable to separate one emotion from another. In those moments, Iran flashed through my mind, not as politics, but as memory. The scent of my grandfather's jasmine shrubs in the backyard, turquoise tiles, Tehran Bazaar, Hafez's poetry, and my friends and family. I thought of those still there and of those who may not survive to tell their stories, and I grieved for them and for us in diaspora. For those of us who fled seeking safety only to watch our adopted country strike the place we still call home. It felt like a betrayal, even when it wasn't. I grieve too for those in the US who must now bear the weight of watching violence unfold in their names. Their grief is different but real. I grieved for the Lebanese, Palestinians, Syrians, Israelis, and for us Americans. And in that shared sorrow, I saw a fragile kind of hope that even across borders and identities, we might hold one another in the dark. That grief, when shared, might become something more than sorrow, maybe even a bridge. So why aren't we bridging this? Thank you for listening, everyone. Now I will introduce our first speaker, my colleague, Professor Charlie Kurzman, who's the Philip Stader Distinguished Professor of Sociology at UNC. Dr. Kurzman specializes in political sociology, social movements, and Middle East and Islamic studies. His books include The Missing Martyrs, The Unthinkable Revolution in Iran, and Democracy Denied. He explores topics like Islamist politics, democratization, and US immigration policy. Please welcome my colleague, Dr. Kurzman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacobi, for the introduction and for your heartfelt and well-spoken remarks about the personal experience of warfare. My remarks are going to be more impersonal about the politics of this current crisis, and in particular on the institutional position of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The first thing that I would like to start with is to note that the three countries that have been engaged in this war over the last 2 weeks, which currently at the moment appears to be in a ceasefire that will hopefully stand. All three countries are really quite unique. The United States is the wealthiest and most powerful country in world history. Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, also and not coincidentally, currently engaged in a conflict with Palestinians that involves large-scale killing of Palestinians, and Iran, a theocracy run by a religious scholar, unique in the world. But all three of these countries have at least one thing in common. Their governments are deeply unpopular with their own populations. In the US, the dominant political figure of the past decade now, Donald Trump, has never had popularity ratings over 50% on a consistent basis. In Israel, the dominant political figure of this century so far, Benjamin Netanyahu, is even more unpopular. 2/3 of Israelis, according to a recent survey, and that includes 2/3 of Israeli Jews, think that he should resign. And in Iran, the dominant political figure since 1988, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is also widely unpopular among Iranians who've engaged in mass protests, such as the Woman Life Freedom protest over the past several years, in opposition to Khamenei and his government. So all three leaders, although they control the institutions of power in their countries, are underwater, as the pollsters say. That is, they have more opponents than allies in their own country. And so they have, each of them, an incentive for picking fights overseas with foreign countries, with outsiders, to boost their support domestically. That said, only one of these three leaders has proved not to be a gambler in this current crisis, refused to escalate the current crisis. And that, surprisingly, is the 86-year-old theocrat in Iran who says that he welcomes martyrdom. So Khamenei definitely responded to the Israeli and US attacks on Iran. Preventive attacks, one should point out, designed to prevent some future attack by Iran, but not in response to an immediate, imminent threat. Khamenei responds by sending more than 1,000 missiles and drones at Israel, and a volley of missiles at a US airbase in Qatar. Most of these were intercepted by US and Israeli defenses, as Iran knew they would be, and in fact tipped off the US indirectly through Qatar to their arrival. So the damage that these counterattacks caused, while real, especially in Israel, where there were, I gather, dozens of fatalities and several hundred people wounded, as well as material damage, which I should point out is far less than the damage that was caused in Iran, where there's several hundred fatalities and correspondingly more injuries and property damage. The damage that Iran caused seems to have been calibrated so as not to escalate the conflict further. That is, enough to show the Iranian people that the government is defending their homeland, but not so much that that the US and Israel would be forced to escalate further, to respond even further. So my question I've been asking myself is, what's going on with Iran, in particular with Khamenei, because he is ultimately the sole decision maker on major issues in Iran. What's going on there that they did not respond further, that they did not want a broader conflict, because they could have engaged in any number of other forms of military responses, including through naval attacks on oil tankers, that go along the coast of Iran, attacks elsewhere on U.S. forces, even attacks through allies or other actors abroad. They did not engage in those sorts of responses. Why not? And I think I'd have three things I would like to say about this that tell us something about the institutional position of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The first is that Khamenei is quite old and not entirely well. And for some time now, he's been signaling that he's concerned about a smooth transition to a successor as leader of the Islamic Republic. Now, the Islamic Republic is, by design, constitutional design, almost entirely reliant on this single person in this leadership position. This is the position that was first held by Ruhollah Khomeini, called Imam by his followers, until his death in the late 1980s. And then since his death, Ali Khamenei, the current leader, has held this now for 30-something years. Because constitutionally, all power resides, or almost all power resides in this position, it is extremely important to have it filled by somebody who is going to be considered a reliable defender of the Islamic Republic, and to have that position filled quickly. And wartime makes it extremely complicated, or even more complicated, to have this transition go smoothly. Apparently, Khamenei has nominated several possible successors so that to smooth the transition in case he were to have died during this conflict. It's a sign of the level of concern. I think it's also a sign that he does not want to give his successor a country at war, that this transition is going to be hard enough without this huge international crisis being ongoing. So I think that might have been a motivation for wanting a more limited military engagement. The second thought I have is that the Islamic Republic itself feels itself to be under siege. Ever since it came to power in 1979, the Islamic Republic has committed itself to a position that it sees as anti-imperialist against the United States, as well as against, at that time, the Soviet Union. And the US has responded in kind. It has been hostile to the Islamic Republic from the very beginning. Of course, the hostage crisis did not help matters. But even since then, for decades, the US has been ratcheting up its policies that are hostile to the Islamic Republic. Even with the nuclear accord, Obama did not fully remove all of the sanctions on Iran, this multi-phased, multifaceted embargo that the US has put in place on Iran that largely prevents Iran from doing business with international trading partners, from linking with international banking systems, and so on. So Iran, aside from the US, Iran is surrounded, or almost surrounded, by hostile or at least unsympathetic states that it cannot count on to help defend it, with the possible exception, in some cases, of Iraq. It has no major real allies around the world. Since the fall of the Assad regime in Syria at the end of last year, which was perhaps the only state ally that Iran had, a serious deep state ally, you have Russia and China that are willing to do business with Iran, including military equipment in Russia's case. But neither of them seem likely to help Iran in a crisis, except by issuing press releases, which is what we've seen in the last 2 weeks. The only true allies Iran has are themselves quite weak. So that would include Hezbollah, the party and militia movement in Lebanon, the Houthi government in the north part of Yemen, a number of militias in Iraq, a handful of other allies. Not a great collection to be going to war with, honestly. And as a result, Khamenei has always had to tread very carefully. I mean, he understands, and his government understands, as many Americans do not understand, that Iran is basically a mid-level power. They are not a superpower. They are not a major threat to the world. They have a mid-level military that finds itself up against much more powerful countries with much more powerful militaries, and that would include the Israeli military. So to survive, the Islamic Republic feels that it has to be cautious and careful. And so it does not gamble, generally, in the same way that we've seen the Israeli government and the US government gamble with forms of escalation in this current crisis. The third point I want to make, and final point, is that the Islamic Republic is a mass mobilization regime. It came to power through one of the largest mass mobilizing, largely peaceful revolutions in world history in 1978, 79. And it has mass mobilized in the war against Iraq. It has and suffered, as Dr. Yacobi mentioned, suffered tremendous losses, perhaps 200,000 fatalities, and hundreds of thousands more injured, as well as the widespread fear that Dr. Yacobi referred to so movingly. This mass mobilizations have recurred periodically on political issues as well. Whenever Iran, the government, the Islamic Republic, has faced challenges, or if there's major social goals that it wants to try to achieve, it mobilizes its supporters through the Basij voluntary forces, through political rallies, through commemorations of the war dead from the Iran-Iraq war, through all sorts of mechanisms. My colleague in sociology, Professor Ali Kadivar, has written about these pro-government mobilizations in Iran. They are quite common, and more common than in many other countries, and in a way an inheritance of this mass mobilization origin, its revolutionary origins. The challenge here is that every time that the government mobilizes its supporters, it also ends up mobilizing its opponents. So the mobilizing for political elections, which are semi-free in Iran, has ended up generating counter-mobilizations among supporters of opposition candidates or reformist candidates. The same with mass mobilization around social issues. There's a backlash, including the largest backlash in the history of the Islamic Republic, the Woman Life Freedom Movement, sparked in 2022, and largely suppressed, but still simmering these days. And I believe that Khamenei's caution in dealing with this current international crisis may be to avoid triggering the mass mobilization of the Woman Life Freedom protest and various other forms of protest that could easily gain steam if a mass mobilization on behalf of the regime, on behalf of a new war, on behalf of aggression, a defense, as they would see it, against aggression, that's a very risky endeavor. These are three reasons, then, that I think that Khamenei has been somewhat restrained in his response to this crisis, one having to do with his own personal position in the succession of power, the second having to do with a recognition of Iran's weakness in the region and in the world, and the third having to do with the potential for mass mobilization that the regime itself has cultivated since its very emergence in the late 1970s. I'll stop here, and I look forward to hearing from the others. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kurzman, for the very thought-provoking 3 points that you addressed and you posed for us too to think about. Our next speaker is my colleague, Professor Noor Ghazi. Professor Ghazi is a professor of practice in the Peace, War, and Defense curriculum at UNC, specializing in peace building and conflict studies. Professor Ghazi has led virtual exchanges between UNC and Mosul University students, produced the documentary called Mosul, Mother of Two Springs, and continues to build academic bridges between Iraq and US. The floor is yours, Professor Ghazi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yacobi, for the amazing introduction. And I also want to thank you on a personal level on your personal experience that you have shared with us today. I would have to say that when I reflect on my personal experience living under the regime of Saddam Hussein and later on after the US invasion of Iraq of 2003, I've always had these conversations with people who had this life experience and who actually served in Iraq as well. And we have talked about the 2 different sides of the stories. However, this is my very, very first time hearing the story from the Iranian side. I was not born during that time. However, I lived those experiences through my family and through the older aunties who died waiting for their sons to return from the prisons in Iran and who joined the war at the age of 18 years old at no choice. So thank you again so much for sharing this experience. I would like to take a different route here into looking at this conflict from a different lens. And I could not help but compare between the conflict that occurred in Iraq with the US invasion/liberation of Iraq of 2003. And the reason I give these 2 titles is because it depends on who's looking, what view we're having at the that time of the Iraq war, let's call it. And I usually tell my students, I will leave you by the end of the semester to decide whether you call it an invasion or liberation. But we always talk about lesson learned from Iraq, and I could not help but to compare between the similarities and differences in these conflicts. And the first one that comes up is the security concerns in the region. And as we may know, for both cases, the concern was about the WMD, the weapons of mass destruction, that played a critical role in this conflict. At that time of the US invasion of Iraq, when the US justified that the invasion of Iraq was based on Saddam Hussein's possession of the weapons of mass destruction, which for us as Iraqis did not really confirm, or for the Iraqis, they believed that Saddam Hussein had the possessions of the weapons of mass destructions. And I recently came across a book in Arabic that talked about how during the US invasion of Iraq, Saddam actually used baking flours to trick the soldiers that he actually used weapons of mass destructions, which has proven wrong. He did not possess that WMD at all. And today we see the similarity with the Israel, where expressed serious concern over Iran's nuclear program, fearing that it could lead to Iran developing nuclear weapons. And that was the first reason. And then the second one that I want to touch on is the regional stability. As we may know that for both situations, it will, and in the current situation as well, that it may have a very significant implications for the regional stability. After the US invasion of Iraq, we had a period of a long-term instability in the region, not only in the Iraq, but in the Middle East, which also contributed at that time to the sectarian violence and the emergence of groups such as ISIS, and of course, the existence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. When we think of 9/11, and I usually get these questions from my students of, has any of the hijackers in 9/11s were Iraqis? And the answer is no. But then why did we invade Iraq at that time? As mentioned, the weapons of mass destruction was one reason, but also having these ties between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, and believing that Saddam Hussein had ties to Al-Qaeda or will support Al-Qaeda in the future, which led to this war as well. Al-Qaeda did not exist in Iraq at the time of the US invasion. However, it did after that during the time of 2004, which led to the emergence of another group such as ISIS and the power vacuum that was left in Iraq, and also based on the sectarian violence in Iraq. I would like to draw on a personal experience from here. I was in 9th grade at that time when I was asked by a friend of mine whether I was Shia or Sunni, which two terms that never occurred to me. I've never heard of these two terms before. And I went back home and I asked my father and I said, hey, my friend asked me if I was Shia or Sunni. What are these two terms? And he had to explain to me the two terms. And it turned out to be that my mom is Shia and my dad is Sunni. And in Iraq, it goes by the tribal name, the last name. It does not really matter your practice. So by the last name, my mom is Shia and my dad is Sunni. And in this case, we were targeted by both Islamic radical group at that time. And I think this had a huge impact in Iraq, and I believe it touched almost every Iraqi lives at that time. Personally, my father's cousin was kidnapped and he was tortured to death by electrical drill, and he was thrown naked on the trash in Baghdad, and my father was asked to go pick him up. And when my father went to pick him up, he found out that his cousin's body was filled with explosive materials to target the family when they go pick him up. And at that time, when the police got involved and they took my father's cousin to the hospital, then my father went to get the paperwork so he can give him the proper burial. But my father shared with us that when he came back, his time at the hospital, he's tried to identify his cousins, and the way it was done, that he had to go through the pictures because every day the hospital was receiving almost 400 unidentified dead bodies. And he said that the pictures he was going through to see them, they were brutal, the way those people were tortured and killed to death. And his cousin's number was number 167 on that day. And when he was able to identify him, he could not even pick him up to bury him because the militia groups were waiting at the door to target my father. And eventually my father's cousin was buried as number 167, along with many others who were just buried merely as numbers. And I believe this is what conflict does to us. And these are the unseen stories. It goes untold. And those unfinished dreams goes unseen. So this is just one story amidst hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of civilians who are being impacted by the conflict as we speak today. The impact on civilians, and I think this is the biggest highlight for me, for many, many reasons. As a person who as a child, my very first childhood memory, my core childhood memory was about war and in war after the Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So in 1991, that was my very first childhood memory. Despite the fact of growing up under Saddam Hussein's regime and under the US economic sanctions on Iraq. So I believe those memories and those conflicts and the conflict that we witness today, it really scars the children memories forever, just like Dr. Yaqoubi mentioned her personal experience. And as I'm also talking about my personal experience, because I feel like this childhood, it went unseen, it went untold, it went unheard, and I only questioned about why I don't have a pencil when I go to school. Why do I have to share just that little one pencil with my two siblings? And it was really just a fight every night over who's going to take that pencil to which class tomorrow, until we figure out a fair share system of whoever is having math class will deserve that pencil at that time, or even just having the proper meal when we go to school. Over 1 million children died from malnutrition in Iraq during the economic sanctions at that time. And then with the US invasion of Iraq, it was not any better when it opened the door for the sectarian violence. With the US invasion of Iraq also, when just a conflict would erupt on the street in front of the children, and then you could die from a stray bullet or you could die from a car bomb. As one day I was leaving school with my best friend, the convoy was targeted and fire was open, and students were killed that day as I witnessed my best friend falling down and being transported to the hospital and announced dead next morning. So these are the stories that I want us to think about today. When we look at the conflict and we witness the wave of cars leaving Tehran because of the conflict, because they needed to evacuate Tehran, I want to think about all the other conflicts around the world that left millions of people to reflect and think about this journey, where they had to leave everything they worked for in a split of a second to decide to rescue their children or to give them a better life. And this is what happened also in 2006 when my dad, after his cousin was killed, decided to leave Iraq. And he said, because I wanted to give you a better life. And this journey was not easy. And this journey is not going to be easy on those millions of people who are fleeing Iran today. On my very sweet 16th birthday, the day we left Iraq. And again, we were stopped at a gunpoint with a very simple question: what is your last name? Are you a Shia or a Sunni? And we had to hide my mom's ID because we knew that Al-Qaeda were in control of that area. And we lived on a survival mode. And this was the only wish, is to survive this conflict, to survive until the next day, and then the next day, then that's another story. So I will leave you with the question of the lesson learned from the Iraq war, and what will be the lesson learned from this war, because this is what we always as scholars reflect on. What is the lesson learned? We say no boots on the ground, but will this be enough for this conflict? When we have a very developed technology today, with no boots on the ground would be the strategy. What else we can do as scholars, as community members, to take part in this peace building and to avoid conflict that impacts people we see and we call friend and we call community members. When the conflict erupted, I reached out to Dr. Yaqoubi just to check in, because we have a lot of family members that it impacts them today and will impact the generation of people who are living in Iran today and other side of the world that has conflict. So thank you so much, Dr. Yaqoubi, for organizing this, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Noor, for sharing your lived experiences and your expertise with such nuance and complexity with us. Our next speaker is my colleague, Professor Navin Bapat, who's the Dowd Professor of Peace and War in the Department of Political Science and the chair of the Peace War Defense Curriculum at UNC. Dr. Bapat's research focuses on conflicts involving violent non-state actors, terrorist campaigns, insurgencies, and the effectiveness of economic sanctions. He is the author of Monsters to Destroy: Understanding the War on Terror. Professor Bapat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacoby, and I want to thank you for your sharing of these very personal stories, along with Professor Riazi, and I would like to thank Dr. Kurtzman for his insights. I'm going to try to build on those. What I'm going to share again is not a personal story. It's going to be more thinking about the analysis of why the United States chose to strike Iran, and what was hoped to gain from it. So I'd like to try to sort of think about this and step back and to look at what is the logic for why the United States took the action it did. And then I'd like to raise some questions and think about, again, this is not stating an opinion, it's really trying to get everyone to think through, was the case worth it, or was it the appropriate strategy for the United States to adopt, and perhaps maybe what we can expect afterwards in the region. So it's to sort of take a step back and think about Iran's relationship with the United States, and that goes back to 1979. I don't want to go back that far, and Professor Kurtzman has talked about that already, but to look at the original agreement between the United States and Iran, which was the JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The idea of that was to leave, as Professor Kurtzman said, some sanctions on Iran, but to relieve some other ones in exchange for Iran limiting its enrichment of uranium, which the idea would be by limiting the enrichment of uranium, it would prevent Iran from developing any sort of nuclear weapon. And in doing so, it would perhaps preserve some form of peace between Iran and its neighbors, with the assumption that in the absence of these preventative measures, Iran may develop such a weapon, which might threaten some of the Gulf states and also, in particular, Israel, which also relates to several U.S. interests in the region, especially the open passage of the Strait of Hormuz, where much of the world's oil originates. So the idea there was to try to limit some of these disputes by preventing Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon. After the Trump administration won the election of 2016, it soon pulled the United States out of this agreement, even though by most independent analysis, it seemed as if Iran was complying with the terms of the deal. Part of their reasoning for this was they said that Iran was not cooperating with the deal was not a good deal in the first place. Perhaps Iran was the leading state sponsor of terrorism. And so to look at those particular risks, it's important to think about all of them. Was it really a risk if Iran developed a nuclear weapon, and how much that posed a threat to the rest of the region, and how much was the threat of terrorism? After recent events, in Israel in October several years ago, we can see that terrorism could be a threat, and certainly was a threat that day. But generally, if we look at terrorism in the aggregate, terrorist groups are not terribly harmful, right? They don't tend to kill that many people. Their level of fatalities are fairly low. They don't survive very long. There are some exceptions to this, and we do see some big terrorist attacks like 9/11. But for the most part, terrorist organizations don't seem to cause all that great deal of damage. So under those circumstances, questions could be raised as to whether or not the Trump administration should have pulled out of the deal in the first place. We then get to today, where the Trump administration was seemingly trying to negotiate another deal with Iran after pulling out of the initial deal. So the question is, why did bargaining fail? In theory, right, if we go to international relations theory, both the United States and Iran would benefit from some form of a deal and from avoiding conflict. Given that conflict is damaging, conflict is risky, conflict is costly. From the United States perspective, certainly there was, I think, a desire to avoid getting embroiled in a large conflict in the Middle East again, resembling the Iraq War. And from Iran's perspective, they probably also wanted to avoid an attack by both the United States and Israel. So there was an incentive seemingly for both of them to try to get to some negotiated settlement. Now, according to international relations theory, and drawing from some of the ones that we use in studying in political science and studying conflict in political science, one of the arguments for why the United States needed to attack rests in something called the commitment problem, with the idea being that today, when Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, the United States was in a position to make sure that Iran, assuming Iran is an adversary, and the United States does see it as an adversary, but the United States had an incentive to try to contain Iran and to make sure that Iran could not threaten its neighbors. Today, it's possible because Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. However, in the future, if Iran were to develop a nuclear weapon, and Iran did seem to be enriching uranium at high levels, which suggested to the United States that perhaps Iran could be a potential threat to its neighbors or to its allies, then that would change the dynamic of negotiation. While the United States could contain Iran today, in the future, it may not be able to do so. And so if we follow the logic of the commitment problem as it's generalized to international relations, it makes sense to strike your adversary while you have the advantage. And so that seems to be what the United States was trying to do there, to try to hit Iran and diminish its ability to develop potential nuclear weapons at this point, while it still had the upper hand, rather than wait for Iran to potentially break out and develop these weapons. Now, that's a standard argument that's made in international relations. A similar argument was made during the Iraq War when Saddam Hussein was believed to be developing nuclear weapons. The argument for striking him at that particular point was that he did not have them then, so it was worth stopping him at that point before he developed these weapons in the future, and he would be harder to contain. But it's worth thinking through this sort of theory a bit more closely, because we often use the generalized argument to justify these types of behaviors, and maybe that's fine. But what I think we should do is to think about some of the key points in that argument that justify the use of force. The first one that has to be considered is, what is the level of threat? If there is a state that's going to develop these capabilities and is going to grow in power, how strong are they really? Do they really gain a position of strength if the attack waits, or if there is no attack? In this particular case, if we look at the United States and Iran, it looks like the United States had considerable power relative to Iran, and Iran was actually in a position that looked like weakness. As Professor Kurtzman mentioned, the Ayatollah was in an elderly state. If we look at recent developments in the Middle East, Iran's proxies with Hezbollah and with Hamas were weakened as a result of the Gaza war. They had recently lost their ally in Bashar Assad in Syria. So it looked like they actually were in a position of weakness. And then if we add to it that Iran's currency was considerably depreciated, and so their purchasing power and their economy were not doing well, it did not seem that they were in a position to gain a considerable amount of strength. So the question is, if the United States did wait, how much strength would Iran actually gain? From the U.S. perspective, their argument is that the time was now and that the U.S. did need to strike, but I think it's worth evaluating, would Iran have gained enough capacity with the nuclear weapon to actually gain such power that it's fundamentally changed the dynamics of negotiation between the United States and itself? The other thing to think about is, if Iran developed a nuclear weapon, how would they deliver such a thing? Iran is not believed to have the technology to develop something like an ICBM that would be capable of hitting the United States. Iran does have the capability to use rocketry to hit Israel and some of its neighbors, as we've seen during this conflict. But do they have the ability to load this rocket with a nuclear weapon? That's also not believed to be true at the moment. So hypothetically, even if Iran did develop a nuclear weapon, their ability to utilize and deploy such a weapon might have been somewhat limited. Now, again, that could change in the future, but that would also require some time to develop that technology to be able to deploy the weapon. The third point to think about is that even if it's true that Iran could develop the weapon, and even if it's true that Iran could miniaturize the warhead and put it on a rocket and shoot, the question is, how much damage would a strike, a preventative strike like what the United States did, how much damage would that actually do? Now, we've seen that it has caused considerable damage to some of the facilities. It's debatable as to how far it's set back Iran's nuclear program, but we can think how much of this has hindered Iran in the future in terms of its ability to develop these weapons. Well, the technological know-how is still there, so it's just a question of, will they continue to develop these weapons in the future? Is it a few years? Is it a few months? Is it a decade? That much is not sure. Right. And it's not, since it's also not clear what this does to since Iran's attitude towards both parties. If Iran has been hit and there was a previous deal to stop such a thing, will Iran be willing to negotiate in the future and believe that any negotiation with the United States is done in good faith? So again, we have this question of how long in the future can these strikes actually contain Iran? Will it actually stop Iran from developing these weapons? Was Iran actually engaged in such a big shift anyway? Were they going to be a threat to the United States? And was it worth this particular strike? Now, one thing to sort of think about, again, is what is the aftermath of the strike? Given that the United States negotiated once and then pulled out of that deal, and given that the United States was negotiating with Iran and then the conflict emerged and the United States attacked, how willing is Iran going to be to strike a deal with the United States in good faith in the future, Well, that remains to be seen. We have to see the Trump administration does seem to be trying to get a nuclear deal with Iran. And as Professor Kurtzman mentioned, Iran has not fought back and has not used all of its capability, and not, in a sense, has sort of been the party that has not tried to be as aggressive and escalatory in this particular conflict. But I think this does cement the idea that it is under siege, which is consistent with what the regime has tried to push. And it also sort of it cements this idea that the United States might not be a good faith partner, because one time the United States negotiated and it pulled out, and then another time the United States was negotiating and then a conflict took place. So it really does raise, again, big questions as to whether or not this strike actually does what it says it's going to do. Probably, I think there's a good sense that this has delayed Iran's capability. It's uncertain as to how long, but the technological know-how is likely there, and probably the distrust of the United States is also there. So again, it raises big questions as to how effective these strikes will actually be, even if we face this shift of power potentially that Iran would have by gaining a nuclear weapon. So I will stop there and move to the discussion for the panel.
Thank you so much. So everyone, please post your questions in the Q&A, and now we will have the discussion for all of the speakers. There are a couple of questions here, and I can read them, and Dr. Kurzman, Professor Ghazi, and Dr. Bapat, whoever wants to answer, you all can turn on your videos now. The first question is, what are the potential regional and global strategic implications if Iran achieves nuclear weapons capability in 2025, particularly regarding the balance of power in the Middle East and the future of non-proliferation regimes? Whoever wants to take it.
Well, I can try to answer that, right? So I think if Iran develops nuclear weapons capability, likely what would happen is that other states would try to do the same. It's believed now that Israel has this capability already, so Israel may publicly disclose it. Saudi Arabia may also try to develop such a capability, though they do fall under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, or under the U.S. umbrella. So it does seem like they already have their guarantor of security, but if there are concerns about the U.S. guarantee, then there would be an incentive for these states to develop the same amount of weapons, assuming they believe there was a significant threat from Iran, which many of them publicly do say they believe such a threat exists.
If I could add that one of with the focus on nuclear weapons, and I'm certainly no expert on nuclear physics or anything of the sort, but it seems to me that the main concern would be that Iran would use such weapons against Israel. But that seems mitigating against that might be the logic that doing so would also hit huge numbers of Palestinians who the Iranian Islamic Republic would like to help and make some of the territory uninhabitable for an extended period, which would also be contrary to their stated interest in supporting Palestinians. So I've always wondered, like, well, what difference does a nuclear weapon make? Also, the size of the weapon matters, because apparently the relatively small weapons that a country would start out making, the scale of how many miles in circumference the zone would be matters. And so I'm not sure that nuclear weapons by themselves would be a game changer militarily. In terms of politics, though, the fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons, seems to be a signal to other countries not to invade, perhaps, or not to touch them in certain ways. I don't know that if they didn't have them, that they would be invaded. But there's some thought that countries with nuclear weapons might not be pushed around as much in their perspective, even if militarily they're largely unusable.
There is a question about what does everyone think about the possibility of ending the war on Gaza now?
I can start again. So I actually I don't know if what's happened actually encourages Israel to end the war on Gaza at the moment. In fact, I would say probably not. From their perspective, I think this has been successful. And so in that sense, if it's successful, there's also political pressures, I think, on the prime minister right now to not end the war. So having a sort of this specter of war with Hamas has always been, I think, can be useful politically for Netanyahu. And I will say one of the things that might enable it is that there are no sort of clear, distinguished markings of people that tell you consistently or clearly that you are a member of Hamas, right? And so there's no verification if all of Hamas has actually been eliminated from Gaza or not, right? So what the government can do if they choose is to effectively say Hamas is still there in Gaza, and to some extent that's correct. I don't know how deep that is or how many people are Hamas, but probably they are there. And if they argue that the war has to be fought until Hamas is eliminated, there's in a sense no end, right? It can go on indefinitely because some Hamas in theory will still be there. So if that's going to be something that's used to prolong the war for political reasons, I don't see a reason for the government to actually stop the conflict at the moment in Gaza.
I can just add to that, Dr. Yacoubi. I would echo Dr. Babat on that as well. I think Trump's administration stands on this also was very clear from the beginning on the war on Gaza and also the investment in Gaza. So I would also agree with what Dr. Babat mentioned. So yeah.
I'm going to play the devil's advocate because there will be some negotiations with Iranians, right? Do you think Iranians will negotiate Gaza within that negotiation, like the end of war on Gaza, as part of their larger negotiation?
I'm not sure there's going to be a negotiation. It seems to me that a ceasefire is perfect for many of these parties because you can stop the bombs falling and the missiles and the drones and so on, but you don't have to deal with the underlying issues. My sense is that none of these parties really want to deal with the underlying issues because they're hard and they'll be unpopular with their own people. Any deal that Trump would make with Iran is going to be subject to the same criticisms he made of Obama's deal. And the same would be true in different ways for Netanyahu and for Khamenei or his successor, that to make a deal with this enemy who seems to be threatening your very existence is going to be looked askance and been, by people who are suspicious of that. So I'm not sure there's actually going to be. There may be a show of meeting in Oman and so on, but I would be surprised if there's actual serious negotiations going on. Of course, I would like to be surprised because I think agreements are better for peace.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I just don't see the linkage necessarily that Iran would make between Gaza and their own deal with the United States, and I don't think the United States would want to link those issues either. So, or Israel would want to either.
I would like to disagree just for a second. And the reason why, again, I'm looking at it from the Iraqi perspective and what's going on the ground in Iraq today. And the Iranian militia exists in Iraq. They have been, since the war started in Gaza, they have been looking up to Iran in response as like a Shia power in the region in retaliation and having this power versus that the Sunni did not respond at all. And still the militia in Iraq today on the ground, they are looking up to Iran with every missile that they're sending towards Israel. And I think, as Dr. Kurzman mentioned, it could be just a show, but I feel like there will be a mention to that just to do the due diligence at that point, regarding Gaza.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question. Thank you very much for this timely webinar and your invaluable insights. Given that the Islamic Republic will likely face post-war instability and considering the apparent absence of SMOs within the opposition, how do you foresee the trajectory of social and political change in Iran?
I'd like to jump in on that. SMOs, I think, refers to social movement organizations. And it is true that many of the civil society institutions that have stood up over the last quarter century against the hardliners in the Islamic Republic, and some of them standing up against the various constitutional order of the Islamic Republic itself, those have largely been suppressed at this point. However, we've seen large-scale mobilization without the existence of major social movement organizations, institutions that are visible and lasting and therefore destructible. And so I think that there's going to continue to be periodic protests, some of them quite widespread potentially. And I don't think that the feelings that have led to the woman life liberty movement in Iran have faded away. I think those grievances and resentments, and now outrage as well, given the repression of that movement, are still very vivid among a large segment of Iranian population. And all it's going to take is another, opportunity, spark, or something to get those going. I want to mention that there's been reports of a surge in support for the Islamic Republic, for its government, as a sort of rally around the flag effect. And I think that's probably legitimate. I have not seen survey research or anything systematic yet on that subject, but I'm willing to believe it. But I'm not sure how long that's going to last. And especially when the usual problems that the Islamic Republic faces again come to the fore if missiles and bombs from Israel and the US have actually and continue to stop.
I will add that after the ceasefire, there has been a massive crackdown on women and on Iranian Jews as spies. I have Jewish friends in Iran who are in fear of being, arrested and executed. We've had a lot of executions even during the war in the prisons, which go unnoticed when, bombing is happening. So the government, the regime is cracking down internally when things happen globally, which are not in their favor. We have another question about the ceasefire. What are your thoughts on ceasefire? Uncertainty is the most common factor that can negatively affect peace and stability for the region. Do you think the ceasefire will hold? And someone else actually asked, what is stopping the US and Israel from attacking Iran again, since there is no one to hold them accountable?
I'll jump in briefly and let others expand on it if they wish. Ceasefires can hold for many, many decades. We see that with North and South Korea. But yes, the uncertainty of it is highly damaging. And I think that's the situation that we're in. I think it's, frankly, the situation we've been in even before the war, with the hostilities, tensions, and embargoes, and so on, that have left the entire region on edge for decades. This question of will the ceasefire hold, I think, is a really good one. And it really comes down to the question of gambling. Like, is it because I think that what we saw was this really very intentional gamble on Netanyahu's part. And Trump got dragged into it. I mean, the news was that he was trying to tell Netanyahu not to drop those bombs. And then after Netanyahu did it, he was like, okay, yeah, I'm on his side. And so he got pulled into something. It didn't seem like Trump wanted to go there himself. And of course, he campaigned against U.S. involvement in foreign wars. And as I said before, I think there's strong reasons for Khamenei not to want to initiate further strikes. So some part of this comes down to, I think, domestic politics in Israel.
Just to add, I think that analysis is spot on. I'd also say if we look at the since the incentive to strike, the Trump administration has sort of made it clear that they didn't want Israel to strike anymore. And so I think having that level of disapproval from the U.S. president, at least even if it's temporary, poses sort of a short-term restraint on what Netanyahu wants to do, right? Just if the United States is not going to go along with it, I think that would make any military action less comfortable. And so there would be a bit of incentive to restrain there. Now, again, that might change in the future. But for the short term, I don't think that Israel would have an incentive to break it for that reason. I also don't think Iran would also want to break it at the moment. I think they need to recover. I think that, again, there's no reason I think that they have to start a major conflict at the start.
There's a question about the rhetoric and policy priorities of Trump administration and how those influence credibility of U.S. as a mediator in this conflict. And then another question in the same vein asks, how does this affect elections in Israel and the U.S.?
I'll jump in. Not many people associate the words credibility and Trump, and I don't think that that's the reason for his success, that he doesn't require being credible. He'll say things that he then retracts, the next day. He changes his positions on major topics. So I don't think credibility is what's needed for him to try to assert whatever his policy wishes are here. What strikes me is that I don't think he knows what his policy wishes are here. He's not a scholar of foreign policy. Apparently, he is historically and continues to be extremely bored with those topics, as he is for domestic policy as well. And so I don't think he knows what success looks like in the Middle East or with Iran or anywhere, aside from the fantasy that Dr. Ghazi also mentioned about creating a Riviera in Gaza that would be free of the actual Gazans. So I wonder about where we're headed. I think we're stumbling in the dark here. In terms of the effect on elections, I don't think there's going to be much of an effect because, well, first of all, we don't have U.S. elections for more than a year in the midterms, and so people tend to forget things fairly quickly. And assuming this is over, which we can't assume, but if it's over, I think it will be a blip. And in Israel, they have bigger problems to worry about. This is a very divided political community, and so I think they're going to be their elections, when they eventually have them, are going to be decided on issues closer to home.
So to add on to Dr. Kurtzman, a mediator, at least in sort of political science, international relations lingo, is an actor that credibly passes information from one party to another in an effort to try to move both parties to peace. I don't think the Trump administration fits those parameters, right? Especially because they were a participant in this conflict. So given that they're a participant in this conflict, it's hard to see them as being a credible mediator. To also add with what Dr. Kurtzman said, a feature of Trump's both domestic and foreign policy is that he wants to be unpredictable, right? That's something he said, that's something he emphasizes, that it's a bad thing to be actually predictable. But a successful mediator does need to be predictable, right? They do need to pass truthful information back and forth. So if the Trump administration's foreign policy centers on unpredictability and quick moves and realpolitik or changing minds, they don't really fit the sort of definition of what a mediator can be. So they're not likely to be a successful one.
Thank you. A question about the internet blackouts in Iran. What are the implications, and is this something that is designed to aid in Iran's cybersecurity against Israel, or is it used to suppress civilian backlash against the regime in a time of conflict?
Dr. Yagoubi, perhaps you could speak to this, given that you're in such close contact with people in Iran.
So historically, whenever there is internet blackout and people cannot, access internet, there has been mass murders, executions, killings, and cracking down on protests. And the most major one was in 2019 when in one night, 1,500 reportedly were killed. Whenever that happens, which also happened last week, Iranians in diaspora essentially, quote unquote, freak out because we know what's coming. For the past week, it was a different situation because to me, people were trying to survive. I don't think people had the energy or even like mental capacity to put together, protests and be out there because bombs are falling and people are trying to survive. So there wouldn't have been protests. However, it was impacting in a different way. And that was, they are announcing all these evacuations and people are not receiving the messages to evacuate. And there are a couple of pages that my friends have opened on social media, on Instagram pages, where the news that was coming out of Iran are being translated into English and showing the world what was happening to people on the ground. And I was reading one of these stories today, for example, and this mother was telling the story of her and her kids were sleeping, and in the middle of the night she wakes up and she sees she has all these text messages and looks at the text messages. Everyone is telling her that the bombing is 100 feet from kilometer from your house, get out, because internet was down and she hadn't read or she was not notified. So literally she wrote that half of her house in the front was destroyed, but she and her kids, she had to shelter the kids and they were inside the house. So that's what happened during this one. But when there are protests and there is internet blackout and the social media shut down, it's functions in a very different way than the situation last week. Anyone else? Okay. To what extent are US and US and Israeli interests aligned in this attack to Iran, and to what extent do they diverge?
So I'll take it. I think they certainly align, right? I mean, if we look at U.S. and Israel's foreign policies, they strongly align in terms of a lot of what is going on in the Middle East, right? So they tend to converge. I would say in terms of their preferences for this particular conflict, there is some divergence, and it looks like what Israel wanted is a sort of more prolonged campaign against Iran, or at least that was my sort of read on it as we were observing it. But the Trump administration seemed to want to stop it quickly after their bombing and declare victory, right? And sort of move on. And so then after the bombing, they did, or President Trump himself expressed frustration that some of his ceasefire that he negotiated was being violated. And he mentioned Israel specifically as being as culpable for that, in addition to Iran. So that's unusual. Most of the time, American presidents don't sort of identify publicly and fault Israel for these types of things. So he did do that, and that did seem to pull Israel back a little bit from that. So I think President Trump probably just wants this to look like a victory. And I think that that could have something to do with electoral politics. It's a far way away, but I think Mr. Trump prides himself on a strong image and that he's able to get deals and that he's able to win wars. So I don't think he wanted anything to compromise what looked like a successful operation by the United States. So I think that was his reasoning for trying to constrain Israel. But I think both of them share the hostility to Iran, and I think it's certainly correct to say that probably Mr. Trump would not have done this if Israel had not started the initial attack on Iran.
There are a couple of questions, at least three, about the role of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states that are playing in influencing Israeli and US decisions regarding this military assault on Iran. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's worth noting that Saudi Arabia has become a considerable player and power in the region, even more than it was. And that Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of the country, is also in some ways a gambler that is willing to take risks and do things that might have blowback, might be unpopular, but might have upsides as well. And that willingness has led him to engage in, in killing opposition figures, but also to lead the OPEC maneuvering to throw its weight around politically with oil production and all sorts of other deals that I think suggest that this is a power that the U.S. and other players are starting to take far more seriously than they did before as an independent actor, not just a pawn of the United States. That said, I don't think Saudi Arabia or any of the Gulf states wanted this war. They certainly did not want Iran's missiles to be falling on one of their own in Qatar, where the U.S. air base is located. And my sense is that they are going to be as active as possible in reaching out both to the U.S. and to Iran to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And in both cases, that would be either restraining or deterring Israel. So one of the effects, I think, is that this might be a further hardening of the Gulf positions against potential agreement with Israel, which was the hope of the Trump administration the first time around, but seems less and less likely, especially given the severity and the casualties in the Gaza war.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask my question. I would like to hear your thoughts on the possibility of regime change. Do you see
In which
that
country?
in Iran? And I will say why I'm asking this, because recently I was listening to an interview with Karim Sajjadpour, who was quoting Charlie Kurzman. And I will tell you what he was saying about this regime change, but I wanted to hear your thoughts first.
It was very nice of Dr. Sajjadpour to name check me on that interview. But the idea generally is that a popular uprising requires people to overcome their fear. And it's not just fear of the regime, but it's also fear of futility. Like, why bother if you don't think it's going to work? And to overcome that fear and to overcome the sense of futility, you want to see lots of other people doing it too. So you kind of have a critical mass phenomenon where if enough people are out there, more people will join them. And my book, The Unthinkable Revolution in Iran, tried to trace those dynamics in the revolution that overthrew the Shah and brought the Islamic Republic to power in the late 1970s. In those days, there were literally millions of Iranians on the streets and even more who were on strike, on a general strike. It was one of the, if not the most widespread revolutionary mobilization in history. I mean, to have potentially 5% of the population out in the streets on a single day in demonstrations is really astounding. Now, even with the broad, deep support for the woman life freedom movement in Iran, they have not to date reached that critical mass. The numbers were large, but not so large that people felt free and in fact felt compelled, like, where are you if you're not there, to go out and protest, and then to make the kinds of durable commitments to protest, such as a general strike, that would actually lead to institutional change. Now, that's not to say that it can't happen. In fact, one of the key aspects and ironies of the revolution back in 1979 was the Iran experts and the diplomats saying that a revolution was unthinkable. So I don't want to say it's not going to happen, because these things can change quite quickly, but it's very hard. That's why revolutions are rare. And that's why even crummy regimes around the world often last a long time, much longer than you would imagine. It's because it's hard to get rid of them. So I have to say, I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen, but you never know. You never know. And I think that, according to surveys, opinion polls of Iranians in Iran, despite the potential worries that the security apparatus will monitor you and potentially even arresting you for your opinions, even so, huge proportion of the country thinks negative things and says negative things about their government in these surveys. So the latent pool, the constituency for regime change may be there, but the actualization is quite difficult. One other side point is that regime change from the outside is universally unpopular in Iran, as it would be in most countries. To say, please come and invade us in order for us to get a better government. The case of Iraq is next door for Iranians is just one example of how things can go wrong, even when it's, as you put it, Dr. Ghazi, framed as liberation. And then add to that nationalism. People don't want someone else determining the fate of their country, and even when the goals may align. So I think that this idea that we're going to bomb folks enough that they're going to rise up against their rulers does not usually work, and it especially doesn't work if you're telling them to evacuate the cities. So that they couldn't even possibly go out into the streets to demonstrate.
So he was quoting revolution, unthinkable revolution, referencing from there. Any of the other speakers?
I can add a little bit to that. I've actually thought about that as well. And again, I reflect back on the Iraqi experiences back in the 1991 with the Shabani revolution, where 14 provinces out of 18 fell to the rebels in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein just was able to regain control, which was unimaginable. It was something unexpected to happen. I think it plays, there are many factors that plays role into this, as Dr. Kurzman mentioned. And part of it for drawing from the Iraqi experiences is the sense of identity, as Iraqis were being identified as just Iraqi Muslim or like Iraqis, right? And with having these divisions later on of like the Shia, the Sunni, whether I'm Iraqi Muslim, Iraqi Christian, I think that sense of, we started to weaken this sense of unity against just one institution or government. And I think in Iran, it will depend on those factors. And also it will depend whether, even if it happens, how successful this could be. Is it possible to happen? Yes, very likely, I think, from my understanding of like the Iranian society, but how successful it will be, that would be the question. Also, would Iran be receiving some sort of support from the Iraqi government? I do believe that will happen if a case of revolution happens in Iran.
Well, thank you so much. So Karim Sajadpour was saying that if not a revolution, but if a regime change happens at this point, the next person will not be in turban. It will be a member of IRCG. So we are facing a worse situation. And that's, I would like everyone to leave with this question, like, what have we achieved if we are heading to a worse place? Thank you so much for this conversation, my colleagues, and thanks to everyone who attended and participated asking us questions. We hope that we were able to answer some of your questions, and we will see you in the fall semester in the center. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.